Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome in to everyone. We're back. After 3 weeks of me taking a bit of a break, we're back. I'm sorry that we were away for 3 weeks.
The good thing is, Bernard, some people missed us.
Yeah,
You know,
no, that's true. I keep bumping into
several
people
messages
saying,
"Where's
"Where are
the
you?"
bloody Hoon, you bastards?" Yeah,
Yeah, and that's
just meant that
lovely.
they're not reading the kaka adequately.
Yeah, I mean, it's people set their body clocks to regular events. We are essentially a species that likes regularity and some sort of regular thing to attend or go to. I don't go to church
Do
anymore.
you think we're like church?
Yeah,
People come to the blessed church of the Hoon.
church for old codgers who do pods.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think that's the blessed church of the holy Hoon is where we should go. Yeah.
exactly. No,
I mean,
no,
if
that's,
Brian
that's really
Tamaki
good.
can do it, we can do it, and I'm sure it's tax deductible, isn't it?
He's quite good at the tax deducting.
He most certainly is. He's a bit of a rotter, though.
Yes, and no, that's for another day. Quite a lot of action in the last 3 or 4 weeks, and all sorts of
Well,
parts
yes,
of the
I was
politics.
one of the things that I was thinking about our absence was very much Jesus Christ. There's been an election. There's been Macron. Biden tripped over his own shoelaces, and the Aotearoa went aground. So there's a lot happening. It's the usual in New Zealand, of course. It's the usual "she'll be right, mate" infrastructure cock up.
Yeah, and
But otherwise, it's really important stories.
yeah, and unfortunately, we couldn't push the autopilot button
No,
here at the
no.
And it's been a busy old week and all sorts in the last 2 or 3 weeks. You're right. We're going to talk about it this week with Helen Clark and Robert Patman. All
Yeah,
the
for
action.
those who don't know, Helen Clark is the former Prime Minister of New Zealand and former head of the United Nations Development Programme, and an all-round good person and one-woman opposition. And I will try not to call her poor old Helen today. So I got told off by a friend for saying that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we're really looking forward to having her on again. There's so much going on in the geopolitics. It really is the big story these days. What on earth is going to happen in the United States? Not to mention, China, Ukraine, Gaza, and everything else. And it really, makes a difference. And our Prime Minister is over in Washington at the moment.
Yes, he's got a very weird. I noticed yesterday somebody was posting that he's got a rather weird stance, which is the sort of stance with somebody who's, jacked themselves up on steroids at the gym a little bit, and he looks like he's got a little bit like the bulldog in those cartoons with the teeny weeny little back legs and the gigantic chest.
Yes, he is certainly enjoying. I'm informed from the various correspondents. He's enjoying the discussions and the theatre of all of those very important people.
I was amused that Joe Moyer said today that he'd said something like, "I love meeting them all because I'm an extrovert."
Yes, I wonder if they enjoy that.
Yes, I'm not sure he is actually an extrovert either, by the way.
No, and he made the odd gaffe here and there, saying he talked with Emmanuel Macron all the way down to the Prime Minister of Iceland.
Yes, that was it. That was. Although I am glad he's seeing the Prime Minister of Estonia, because I have this theory that far from being the Switzerland of the South Pacific that Muldoon used to talk about with New Zealand, that we should actually be the Estonia of the South Pacific.
Yeah,
which
they're doing
is
some amazing
super
things
duper
with tech,
internet connection, hot and cold running visas for people like grey-haired old men who do weekly podcasts, who want to be international travellers. We need an electronic New Zealand passport.
That's right. So lots of action on geopolitics. We'll have climate discussion as well. Catherine Dyer is back with us at 5:10 to talk about what the government's been doing in our absence, to and for and against
Yeah, it's
the
going to be
climate.
hard to work out just how little they could have done. whether
They're
they could
actually
have
doing
gotten
quite
away
a
with
lot
an
to increase
executive
our
briefing.
emissions. That's the problem.
Yeah.
With all sorts of car standards changes and some fun things. Here, I wanted to show you one piece of
Kit.
corporate verbiage,
Yeah.
if you like,
Sure.
to explain who this government is and how things have changed.
Mm-hmm.
This is the front page of the government's policy statement for transport for
Yep.
2024 to 2034. Essentially, it says this is what we're about, this government with transport. It has a picture of a motorway with 3 Ford Rangers on it.
Essentially, it says more roads, Bernard. Is that right?
More roads and more Ford
More
Rangers.
roads, more roads and bigger roads.
Yeah, and bigger double cab utes and more Ford
Excellent.
Rangers.
And
Yeah.
faster roads as well.
Exactly. Yes. No, he likes a bit of speed, does our Simeon. He's changed the rules while we've been away to make us faster in the cities, which it turns out is a whole bunch of councillors and parents and everyone going, hang on a minute, we quite like that the cars are slow around the schools and in the middle of town because when they hit people, they tend to kill them less. Not to mention, there's lower emissions, and all of the research shows this. What I'm really surprised at with this government is they talk a good game about it's all about the economy, making the boat go faster. We've done our economic analysis. We always got to, balance the environment against the economy. Well, actually do your economic analysis before you make decisions. For example, the clean car discount removal and this week's announcement about watering down of our clean car standards was described as something done after a cost-benefit analysis, but it can't have been because when you look at the emissions impacts, the health impacts, and the foreign exchange impacts of having 300,000 fewer electric vehicles and therefore 300,000 more petrol and diesel vehicles sucking in billions of dollars worth of petrol and diesel refined and which we have to pay for in foreign exchange and at least $10 billion extra in carbon emissions costs. And that's before you take into account the deaths and injuries and sicknesses from all the extra emissions and accidents from these things. So it is
but Bernard, we know, I think, that they're fighting, essentially, they're turning all of these things, as we see with a number of other governments, including the previous Conservative government in the UK, they're turning issues like net zero and, this was the whole, one of the Marine Le Pen platforms was to end the European Green Deal. Reform, the Nigel Farage party is dead against the net zero policies, which they see as a kind of socialist conspiracy to hold us back. Speaking of socialist conspiracies, there's Catherine.
We are a social body here, and what I find interesting about that, Peter, you're right, and the climate is a big story politically, not to mention in physical life here and all around the world. You could argue Australian politics has been completely wrecked, dominated, driven by the climate debate for the last decade. And you can see in Europe and in the UK, it's a big factor. The frustration is that actually, if you were serious about electrifying your economy, you could dramatically reduce the costs of living.
Absolutely.
And we've got fresh research out today, which I put in today's email, showing a 50% fall in the cost of batteries from Chinese factories, and that 2/3 of the new vehicles being bought these days in China are EVs, and that's because they are cheaper than petrol and diesel vehicles. So that's before you look
we
at...
have so many sort of potential advantages in all of this.
Yes, and we, as Rod Drury said this week, we could become the Saudi Arabia of renewable power, exporting our sunlight, if you like, in the form of data centers for these electricity hog AI chips that are churning through the power at the moment.
We might need a few more slightly more robust
transmission lines.
Towers.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Or just have to screw them in.
Yeah, exactly. All the nuts, all the bolts. That's right. So, Catherine, it's been a big week in climate. We've had some announcements from both Simon Watts, the climate minister, and from Simeon Brown. But one of them was a climate strategy announcement, which you'd assume would be a big deal. This is a government, there's been lots of questions about its climate strategy. They've done a lot of things which might require a response. The climate is a real happening thing. And so we got it. What did you make of the 3 pages and 5 bullet points?
Well, I was really excited to hear they had a strategy because it seemed to have been missing in action until now. And then we got this document and it said strategy on it, but it didn't have strategy in it. So, I don't know what's going on there.
It's just a word, Catherine.
Yeah, well, normally even in business, when you have a strategy, you have some goals, some objectives, and you have a path that you've planned in order to reach those. And this document didn't have any of that. It just had some wishful thinking on it with some nice pictures and And
So
even I was saying the Ministry for the Environment, the website where they've got it loaded up, it's tagged as a brochure.
I mean, there's often a joke about that, as it's not so much a policy document as a brochure, but what it isn't, it seems, Catherine, is a whole of government approach. And I noticed this morning RNZ had a very good environmental person on, or an academic, talking about this and saying, this looks like a sort of she didn't say this, but it looks like a sort of band-aid to say, yes, we've got a climate policy, but it most certainly isn't the kind of whole of government approach that you felt you saw and hear from James Shaw and the Labour government, even if James was not always totally successful in getting it through. The climate minister is, I believe, now in the cabinet, correct, with the defenestration of Melissa Lee.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, I think, when you look at what most experts have been saying about that document over the last few days, one of the biggest stories coming out is the lack of policy coherency, which is exactly what you're talking about. It's a whole of government approach. It's where you have ministers who look after portfolios that are responsible for a lot of emissions would have targets and KPIs and responsibilities that are in line with our border targets around reducing emissions, and that you don't have policies all over the place that are actively undermining one another, which is what it looks like we have at the moment. Is we have a bunch of things going on in different departments which are completely undermining the targets for carbon emission reductions, and that's just incoherent. And one of the big problems with that is if you're running around doing a whole lot of things that basically undermine each other, then you are wasting public resources, you are reducing the welfare and the well-being of the public, of people.
Yes.
And there's, it's just bad policy making. So,
do you think we could get Shane to fast track a couple of dams, hydroelectric dams?
Jeez, I hope not.
And some data centres.
Well, actually, there's some things that are being driven through fast track. There's been a couple of big solar farms that are going through. There's a wind farm that will go in under the fast track rules. So, the government is keen to do it.
Good.
I think
good balancing, Bernard, of that assertion. That's very good. Thank you.
And so there is, they're trying to do some things, but every time they do one thing, they do something on the other side to produce another forecast 3 million tonnes of emissions. And every time they do it, they're building up this massive carbon liability, which is not in their books, which even from the clean car discount and clean car standard changes in the last couple of weeks would add upwards of $10 billion to the
over
climate
what period,
liability.
Bernard? Because is it worth just re-explaining that? Because what we're talking about there, isn't it, is the dilemma that to some extent James Shaw left us with, which is the uncovered and possibly rather difficult to find overseas carbon credits that we will have to buy to offset things, correct?
In his defence, he would say, I would have done things differently so we didn't have to buy these credits. Labor also signed up to this idea that if we don't hit our targets, we'll just solve our problem by giving some money to someone in the Solomon Islands or Panama to plant some trees or whatever it is. But the numbers are getting really big now, and of course, the assumption that, and remember, it's 6 years away. It's not that far away now.
Bank holds
so the time frame is normally up to
liability
2030.
or Treasury. Sorry, Catherine.
So this is a Treasury issue, and it's a live debate now about whether it should be recorded in the Crown accounts as a liability, which then forces the government to do something about it. Catherine, talking about distractions and red herrings that keep flying out of the government from the main task. What did we hear this week on something called carbon capture and storage, which sounds great from Simon Watts?
So Simeon Simon Watts, I think it was Simeon Brown, who's
Oh, yes.
launched a
He's the energy
a
minister too. That's right.
legislative framework for carbon capture and storage, and they've got a bunch of assumptions and their workings behind it, saying that they're going to capture 100% of the CO2 emissions related to gas fields by 2027 and to coal-fired technology by 2030.
Cool.
So the whole thing is based on a lot of very big assumptions, and I mean, I guess from my point of view, I'm kind of like, at some point we probably will need some kind of legislative framework for CCS, whether we like it or not. There's probably some of it coming, so I don't have a particular problem with that. But given the enormous lacuna or gap in the amount of
Lacuna is a word we don't hear from nearly often enough, actually.
Exactly.
This
That's
is
what
a
I thought
high-class
before I chucked it in
podcast.
there. Yeah. But given the huge gap in actual emissions reduction policy that's going to be useful, it would be nice if they were working on that instead of this kind of airy-fairy stuff, because, the carbon capture and storage, the idea that it will have a big impact in New Zealand over the next decade is pretty,
Well, on the
it's
other
pretty...
hand, so there was a very interesting story, I think it was in the Financial Times this week, that Microsoft has done the largest carbon capture deal ever with Occidental Petroleum, $500 million to build and help build, and they've bought carbon credits from Occidental to use carbon credits to carbon capture and to offset some of this growth from data centers, because of course Google and Microsoft have predicted, I think, between 30 and or have shown already between 30 and 50% more energy use or carbon use.
Yep, they know that they're not going to get to carbon zero without something like that. Actually, the American government has put something like $5 billion investment behind CCS since 2010. You'd think there'd be a whole lot more carbon
But this is an
stored.
actual commercial transaction which has to be delivered on, so it's a very practical one. But of course, what they can't do, which is another
the problem with
thing.
all of this is, there was a report out of the Smith School at Oxford University a couple of years ago that said if you take a high CCS pathway to 2100, it will cost you about $1 trillion more per year than if you take a low CCS pathway. So it is a super expensive way to go about doing things, and it really just allows us to keep burning fossil fuels for longer, which is why there is so much money floating around from fossil fuel interests who want that and want governments to invest in it so that they can maintain their business model for longer.
And
so
it's interesting also, Catherine, that they were. I mean, I'm trying to be positive on this just because it was a commercial deal. Occidental's a very serious company. Microsoft is, although, of course, there's also the problem potentially of using carbon capture to force out to contribute to the extraction of what's left in fossil fuel fields, is that you can pump it in as a method to get more gas and oil out of, which is extremely handy. But they were also talking, Catherine, that this process can now reduce they believe it will reduce the cost per ton of carbon stored from $1,000 to $1,200 down to about $400 to $600 per ton of.
The trouble
carbon.
is,
Well, see, this is where you are going to need some legislative frameworks to hold organisations responsible for, if there are any leaks or what happens to how you maintain that, having it stored safely underground in perpetuity, basically,
and also it's a bit like nuclear in that it's one of these over the horizon big Hail Mary solutions which aren't there yet, which allows you to keep on going with this idea that, I'll be able to do the big project to deliver it for my boss or my teacher on Monday morning. I'll do it on the Sunday night. I'm going to spend the next 2 or 3 days on a party. And this is the problem. For example, MB just quietly in the last couple of days has put out its assessment of how much extra emissions will happen because of the reversal of the ban on oil and gas emissions. And it turns out that this is going to cost, if you like, by 2035, an extra 13 million tonnes. So we're going to generate an extra 13 million tonnes of emissions. And then the carbon capture, they've estimated that, is going to take away about 4 million tonnes. So just in this last week, they've made 2 announcements, one of which sounds good. The other one, they didn't even mention the effects, which leaves us another -9 We're going to have to buy the credits for 9 million tonnes of carbon. And that's before the Clean Car Discount Scheme, which is another 3 or 4 million tonnes. So as you point out, Peter and Catherine, it is an incoherent policy, which seems to have different parts of government working against each other. And, they're at the point where, they've arrived at school and the teacher is expecting the homework, and they've essentially gone on to ChatGPT just before they jumped on the bus and come up with something to hand in. It's not good enough.
Yeah, another thing I'd say about it is that something that Christina Hood, who is an expert in carbon markets, has picked up is this seeming misapprehension amongst a lot of government ministers that the ETS is going to be able to make up for all of the extra emissions that they put out in different areas, that it will be able to offset them, so to speak. And the ETS doesn't work that way. Like that is simply just a misapprehension about how it operates and what it's capable of doing and how much it can actually make up for some of those extra emissions. So I think, it's a little worrying that we seem to have a lot of these either naive techno-optimists the mechanisms and instruments that we've got actually work. That's worrying, that it's incoherent, and also that it seems to be riddled with
What can we do to help
things.
explain that, Catherine? I mean, it sounds to me as though we need to get the climate minister in on the Kaka and on the Hoon. What else can we do to explain to people what's going on here with the ETS, the carbon, the carbon credits, and so on?
So Christina Hood did a really great article in the Post and looking at that particular issue and explaining why it was the way it was, but also saying that what you really need, and again, this comes back to policy coherency, you need to have targets across government. You need to have department heads and ministers in all of the areas where they have high emissions, actually having their own emissions targets and perhaps even being responsible for doing something about the holes that they create. Through their own policies. If you don't have those targets set out across government, and this is where this government is kind of saying, oh no, we want to do it, we want to simplify versus what the last government did, and we want to have fewer people with responsibilities and simpler methodologies, but that's simply not grappling with the reality of the situation. It does need to be consistent across government, and we need to have targets and KPIs, and ministers need to be held accountable for what happens in their
and
portfolios.
Also what I'd love to see is a complete reframing of the debate. Now I know it's not convenient for those who want to make climate a culture war issue, but the numbers coming out of China on the falling costs of panels, batteries, and EVs, and I know Catherine, you're right in that. The cost is not always a real one. There is a lot of externalities and costs involved in getting this material out of the ground in all sorts of countries, and a lot of people not being paid enough for their work. But in essence, if New Zealand wanted to electrify its economy fast and remove our reliance on fossil fuels from a purely foreign exchange point of view, and turn ourselves into the Saudi Arabia
of the South Pacific.
Estonia / Saudi Arabia of the South Pacific, with data centres right next to solar farms all over the country. And you could have a surf park in there if you like.
Exactly.
That's happening in Auckland. We should be jumping on this. And there's actually an opportunity. It's one that the geopolitics is telling us it may be a window of opportunity. It may close. And that is that right now the United States and Europe are increasing tariffs on the imports of Chinese-made panels, batteries, and EVs, in large part to protect their own industries. They fear this massive production is going to swamp them with low prices and destroy their key industries, which increasingly they think they're going to need to support themselves in some sort of conflict.
There's also some increased risk of resource grabs going on and different, conflicts being created over that, as well as that conflict over who's going to dominate the industry and how they're going to go about supporting their own industries to grow. So yeah, there are quite a lot of geopolitic
But
geopolitical issues.
it does create an opportunity for us in that we're obviously not going to put tariffs on these things. We've got rid of all our tariffs on just about everything. And we don't have a massive solar panel, EV or battery industry to support or protect. We should be using this opportunity before the shutters come down on this sort of trade. I mean,
Yep.
it's not beyond the realms of possibility that there is some conflict. For example, over Taiwan, the US military are assuming that China will be ready to invade in 2027, and they want to make sure they've got enough drones and chips and bombs and submarines and everything before then. There certainly won't be any trade if that sort of thing happens. We should be filling our boots right now with all of this stuff, because once you've got the panel and the battery and the car, you don't need to import that stuff. And it will go for decades. And we should use that opportunity, I think,
Catherine, how about the immediate scene? We often look at this and we've now gone through the 13th record month globally of temperatures. You got Hurricane Beryl going into Texas with unusually high sea temperatures in the Caribbean and so on. I mean, what's happening here?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because Stats New Zealand just released a couple of new data sets in the last week, and basically what they're showing is that the acceleration in ocean sea surface temperatures around Aotearoa. So they had data sets for 2022 and 2023 showing, that there were parts of the country that were in marine heat waves for, nearly 90% of the year, kind of a thing, which is ridiculous, but also showing that the increased acceleration in sea surface temperatures locally is 2 to 3 times what the global average is. And if you look at the global average charts over the last year for sea surface temperatures, they're massive. Like, they're really scary looking charts. And if we're 2 times that global average, then that's something to worry about, because our sea surface temperatures affect the weather so much in New Zealand. That's what amplifies storms like Cyclone Gabriel and the latest East Coaster. So it has a big impact on us, and the costs associated with that are huge. They're enormous.
Yeah.
Catherine Dyer, our climate correspondent, thank you so much for coming on to the Hoon this evening. As we have a new guest joining us, Helen Clark. Welcome into the Hoon. Lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Are you down at the beach now, Helen?
I am indeed.
You look very stylish for somebody who's reporting from their beach house. I mean, Catherine's normally sitting there with her jandals on, the jandals visible, and smoking a cigar. She was just causing us to slit our wrists about climate change.
I'm actually incredibly enthused about.
Actually, you were.
I want to buy all of China's panels, batteries, and EVs because because the United States and Europe don't want them. We could electrify our country and have no costs for our power and our fuel if we did it real fast. So no, I think there's a great opportunity, Peter.
Yeah, no, you were very positive. And Helen, we were just congratulating the government on their 3-page climate strategy that emerged today, written on the back, literally, of a fag packet. And not a very big fag packet.
So this is sarcasm, right?
Yes, it is. Yes, I'm sorry, you've been overseas. So Helen, we're so glad to.
I did see there was something of that nature around.
Yeah. It could have been pushed under the door of a very slim. A very slim door. Helen, it's really good to have you on again. One of the things that you offered a sort of tour of the horizon, having just come back from one of your overseas expeditions. But can we start with NATO and the attendance at the NATO 75th anniversary event of the Indo-Pacific Four, which is New Zealand, Australia, India, and Japan. How significant is that, and how are you reading the New Zealand aspect of it?
Well, firstly, I mean, Anthony Albanese didn't go. I don't know who's representing Australia, maybe Kevin Rudd or a defence minister or a foreign minister or something, but Anthony Albanese decided he had bigger priorities at home, which maybe tells you how important the summit was. There's been a lot of comments in the media on the NATO summit to the effect that, NATO at 75 is a bit kind of tired and stressed, right? Everyone will be apprehensive about the return of Donald Trump, who may even demand more spending from the NATO allies next time round than the doubling he wanted last time. And let me just say in brackets that the amount of defence spending now developing in Western countries is absolutely devastating for development assistance, humanitarian aid, let alone social policy and investment at home. It's becoming a very, very heavy burden, which does make one wonder, is there another way here? How do we get to this state? Not only Trump, you have Viktor Orban of Hungary, who's just really misused his position as the 6-month chair of the European Council to go to Moscow with this is quite extraordinary. You have the Slovaks who've elected a similar sort of government. You've got, Turkey there that's sort of on and off. You've got, major power like France now in political turmoil, major power like Germany, where the government's clearly in trouble. Probably the happiest person at the NATO summit will be Keir Starmer, who's just come to power with a big majority. So I'm thinking that this NATO 75th isn't a particularly happy occasion. You have Vladimir Zelensky there, obviously trying to lock in support for the future, but you have the sinking feeling that if Trump is elected and slashes US support for Ukraine and demands that they go to the negotiating table, that the UK and Europe aren't going to fill the gap left by the many zillions of the US. So, it may be smiles for the cameras at the NATO summit, but I don't think it's a happy gathering.
But it's not brain dead, is it? I mean, you remember Macron came up with that phrase a couple of years ago, just before the invasion of Ukraine, that NATO had become brain dead. I mean, it's certainly one thing you could surely say about Jens Stoltenberg is that he and the invasion of Ukraine have made NATO relevant again.
Well, yes, I think, the history books will be written eventually about how on earth we got to this, because if you go back to the 90s, there were a lot of agreements signed between NATO and Russia, and, even to the extent of it being floated that perhaps Russia should join at some point. And to see it, spin out to this sad state of affairs in Europe with a devastating land war, could this have been avoided? I mean, hindsight's a great thing, as they say, but it's hard to see a happy ending to any.
But Bernard's desperate to come in for a question, but let me just slide one in quickly literally on the NATO front, because for the first time today, they warned NATO itself, or that 75th anniversary conference, warned China against supplying military industrial equipment to Russia. Like, it was very explicit. First time they've really been quite so explicit about a warning to China that it will face consequences.
Well, I'm sure China's shivering in its shoes.
Are we doing sarcasm? I thought I did the sarcasm here.
Big stick waved at another big stick. I mean, look, I think they have to be specific. What are they alleging? Is it dual use? If you take the Israeli definition of dual use, it's just about everything that's manufactured. Do they have hard evidence of military equipment going to Russia directly or through a third party? I think, you have to substantiate serious allegations like this. Look, of course we see, the president of China and the president of Russia at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, and, bold talk of, the friendship between them. But, China also does value its trade into high value markets in the West. So to what extent it's crossed any sort of line, I don't know. As I say, I've been traveling, but they need to put evidence on the table for serious allegations. I think that one of the more interesting developments of the past week or so has been Mr. Modi,
Mm.
who, of course, is assiduously courted by East and West. And, the Americans have put quite a lot of time into the India relationship. President Biden at the G20 summit there. And there, Mr. Modi, fresh from a bit of a slapping at the Indian election, turns up in Russia and has this bear hug with President Putin, pretty much the same day, I think, that the children's hospital in Kiev was bombed. So, this is a right pickle, I think we could say. And, the Americans have framed this sort of Indo-Pacific, a phrase I refuse to use, almost on the basis that, that there's a common interest here and, India joining Western efforts. But, India's got to run India's race. It's not going to play into anyone else's games, would be my pick.
Helen, we've seen in the last couple of weeks, big drama in the US political scene, and the polls are certainly saying that Donald Trump is set to win. How important is it for New Zealand to be confident in the United States as a player on the world stage when we're making decisions about joining Orcus 2 or not? It seems quite a strange prospect. We're going to take risks with our major trading relationship with a country that might have a President Trump.
Yeah, I mean, the US is not a reliable friend. Ask Ashraf Ghani of Afghanistan. The US, again, will put its own interests first. And those interests may differ slightly from administration to administration, but you couldn't count on it. And those who are trying to, revive ANZUS again, as seemed to be the implication out of the Peters Collins trip to Australia earlier in the year for the joint ministerial meeting, need to remember that ANZUS never had any firm commitment to defend New Zealand from anything. The only obligation was to consult, and then, each party would act in their national interests. So, no, I think that the US is quite politically unstable now and highly polarised. I think for New Zealanders, if Trump wins, which on the current settings he would, one would have thought that the prospect of Orcus would become distinctly unpalatable. Because
do you think that's what they're doing, Helen, is sort of dragging that question out until it's clear what the Trump situation is? Are they clever enough to actually play for time that way?
Oh, I don't think so. I think you have officials in the New Zealand system who are absolutely dedicated to pulling this off, and they've had ministers willingly dragged along with it. No, I think it's more that the AUKUS parties haven't really worked out how Pillar 1 is going to deliver nuclear submarines to Australia, let alone what you do with Pillar 2. Which becomes distinctly unattractive by the day as Trump's ratings rise.
Yeah, Robert, we've got Robert Patman on from Otago University, our resident professor in Tweed. Robert, when Helen started talking just before you came in, we were asking her about the NATO meeting, the significance of the Indo-Pacific 4 being there. She noted that Anthony Albanese hadn't come, although I've realised that Australia sent its Vice Deputy Prime Minister, who is somebody called Richard Marles. But what do you think about the significance of the 75th meeting and of the 4 being invited there in this context, and especially given things that you and Helen have discussed with us before about AUKUS, the China threat, and so on?
Right, good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you.
Your volume is a little bit low, Robert.
A little bit low?
On your mic. Yeah.
Okay. I'll see if I can get the mic a little bit closer. How's that?
Thank you.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Dulcet tones.
Okay. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, lovely.
With regard to the 75th anniversary of NATO, it's one of the interesting things is that I think Mr. Luxon in his face-to-face meetings is beginning to get the message that New Zealand probably needs to do more to support the Zelensky government in Ukraine. So Ukraine has figured very strongly. Unfortunately, there's been little discussion of Gaza, which is been the sort of elephant in the room, really. But with regard to Orcus, it's very difficult to read it. I was interested in Helen's comments that she doesn't feel that there's a crafty plan afoot, to appear to be considering Mr. Biden's original invitation to walk through the door very carefully and not dismiss it, but eventually reached the conclusion after an exhaustive analysis that New Zealand couldn't accept Pillar 2 membership. One of the interesting things is that there is growing pushback in Australia against this. And I'm just wondering, I'd be very interested in Helen's view on this, but I haven't picked up from any government statements that they seem to be aware of this, because I know the Albanese government is maintaining a commitment to AUKUS, but Paul Keating is not a lone voice in the wilderness as he appeared initially when Australia pushed for AUKUS under Scott Morrison. Hugh White, Sam Roggeveen, there's a number of influential people now really coming out and just saying it's going to be a strategic disaster for Australia. It's very expensive, of course. Australia is largely writing the checks. And it seems to me that if Mr. Trump does make it to the White House again, that could be the knockout blow as far as many strategic thinkers in Australia are concerned. And of course, they don't make the policies per se, but I think there's a climate changing in Australia about AUKUS.
Helen, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, no, Robert's absolutely right. There's a lot of pushback from people who've been prominent also in the military and foreign policy establishment. And the debate's been a bit different from that in New Zealand. I mean, we've been out of the US alliance for a long time. They've been right into it. But what is being said is that for the first time since the 1960s, Australia may end up with no submarine capacity whatsoever, because their Collins-class submarines are coming to the end of their life. And the French deal that they had for replacement of the Collins-class, which are conventional submarines, with conventional submarines from the French, would have delivered within an appropriate time frame. Now there's a feeling that these American ones are on the never, because the contract says that, in effect, that they'll come to Australia if there's enough capacity for the American Navy, and that's not clear. But what is clear is America will put itself and its own submarine needs before doing anything for Australia. So then it's sort of pivoted to, well, the Americans saying maybe we could just put our subs in a base somewhere in Australia, and the Australian nationalists are going crazy.
Yeah,
saying,
good on that. Yeah.
This doesn't put us in control of a sovereign submarine capacity. So there really is significant pushback against a flawed deal and an extremely expensive one.
And what about Helen? I was puzzled and intrigued by what you said. Robert runs, as you know, a sort of foreign policy school from time to time down in Otago. Intriguing thing you said about officials presumably in MFAT or in the Prime Minister's office being very keen to is it that they're old relics from the past, or is it that they see their own, in a sense, that national prestige fits with their prestige? That's a very unusual thing to say for you, in a way, that there's a sort of element within the officialdom that is keen on this.
Well, my memory goes back to the original ANZUS rift, and after the election of the Labor government in 1984, officials worked to try to get a deal where a US boat could come to New Zealand with no questions asked. And the offer materialised to have the Buchanan. Yeah. And this was, turned down by David Longy, and he was, really trashed by Australian and US interests for the rest of his life over this. But he did the right thing. But in my observation, the officials have always worked to get back to a position where New Zealand would be close to the year of the elephant. And any opportunities with naive ministers and governments, they'll have a fresh push at it.
Robert, do you pick that up too? I mean, you consort with these people or cavort.
Well, hardly. I don't think
discuss
all public
topics.
policy practitioners have a particularly high view of academics. I think I'm regarded as the classic sort of someone who lives in an ivory tower. But but just to reframe it and get back to your question, my sense is, and I'd be interested in Helen's take on this, that the government came in with, whether it was deliberate or artificial, I'm not sure, or contrived, they rubbished the foreign policy of the preceding government. And they, you had Mr. Peters, the foreign minister, saying he had to repair the wreckage of New Zealand's relations with Australia and the United States. In fact,
During
this
a period in
government
which he was partly
inherited
foreign.
an extremely healthy relationship with both Australia and US, probably better than for a long, long time. Now, the reason I mention this is that as part of this business of distancing themselves from what went on before, when in fact they were, assuming a great deal of continuity in many ways, the government indicated something quite different about Orcus, which was a departure from the previous government. This government linked tighter or closer relations with traditional allies with membership of Pillar 2.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that sent a signal to officials, particularly ambitious ones. How can we make this happen for this government, which sees Pillar 2 membership as a bit of a benchmark, a bit of a symbol, a trophy of tighter relations? Because this is something the government's repeated. We want closer relations with traditional allies. Now, of course, we can pick that apart. For example, how traditional are traditional allies? The United States, I think, has moved tremendously since the time when Helen was Prime Minister. It's almost a different, the polarization there, the political extremism that's emerged. Many Americans, in fact, I was talking to a good friend of mine recently who's in the US over the weekend, and there's genuine fear if Trump wins the election that democracy will be in doubt. So,
Robert, I don't want to interrupt you, but I have to move you on to a different, because you brought it up about there being not really any discussion, as far as we could tell, at NATO about Gaza. Helen has been travelling and thinking about this and watching it, and of course also has this interesting role, which I know I asked you about last time you were on, Helen, but I want to do it again, about UNRWA and the UNDP. But Helen mentioned to me yesterday that she just read that 90% of housing, or 90% of construction really in Gaza, had been destroyed or damaged. Of course, there was a letter in the Lancet yesterday saying that the ultimate death toll eventually, if it goes the same way as Syria and Iraq and has on all the knock-on effect, could be 186,000 people, not just the 36,000 or 38,000 that have been counted so far. I mean, Helen, how are you reading the situation there? Because we've also got, of course, this flashpoint but on the northern border of Israel and the southern border of Lebanon with Hezbollah.
Yeah. So the estimate now is that 90%, that's 9 out of every 10 people in Gaza, have been displaced from their homes. And there's yet another sweeping operation going on where people in Gaza City are being told to move again.
Yeah, now, to the safe places, through the safe corridors.
To a safe place where you get bombed when you're there or bombed when you're on your way there. It is a catastrophic situation. I mean, what is the objective here? To make Gaza so unlivable that people will try to push over the border into Egypt or whatever. I mean, it's just beyond catastrophic what people are going through. Look, I personally think that the 38,000 recorded death toll is probably an underestimate. We don't know how many people are under rubble. We also know that the toll of traumatic injury and trauma is extremely high. Look, at the moment, it seems that there are sputtering talks continuing about whether there be a ceasefire. And the break issue on this now is that Israel keeps insisting that even if there's a ceasefire, it reserves the right at any time to go in and bomb again. And that's what Hamas has been holding out against, although showing some signs perhaps of not being quite as rigid on that, because some of the reporting now, whether it's based on any serious opinion polling, I don't know how you do that in Gaza at the current time, is suggesting that people are pretty fed up with Hamas as well, who they feel have brought this particular catastrophe down on the heads of Gazan people. But it just goes on. I mean, America had no bottom lines. You might recall Biden and Blinken saying that they couldn't support an assault on Rafah unless there were credible plans.
Those
for where
red lines are
people would
rather
go.
pale now.
No, I mean, the red line's a bit like Obama and Syria, wasn't it? The red line just became a line in the sand which the wind blew away. So, yeah, they're just a dreadful, dreadful situation.
Well, may I ask you both? So, a question about the ICC. So, it's believed that Keir Starmer may withdraw the UK's objection to Netanyahu being charged by the International Criminal Court, and also the Attorney General that's just been appointed in the new cabinet is one of the judges who wrote the judge.
We just lost you, Peter, I think.
Statement on genocide. I mean, Robert, can you see the New Zealand? Where do you see? Maybe a short last word from both of you, please, on Gaza and ICC.
Well, I definitely like New Zealand to support the ICC, and I'd like us to expedite our recognition of a Palestinian state. I'd also like New Zealand to speak up at meetings such as in Washington at the moment and say, while we fully support protecting the rules-based order in Ukraine, we also are very concerned at its erosion in the Middle East. After all, the international rules-based order in which New Zealand has a critical stake can't be compartmentalized between regions. And it seems to me that we should be at least trying to articulate as best we can that there's a urgent need to bring this situation to a ceasefire in Gaza. The other thing that really worries me, that Helen would know more about than I do, is the fact that it doesn't seem that Israel has really responded to international demands to let more food into Gaza.
No. The capacity to get humanitarian relief in there is pretty thin. Yes, I mean, looking at the background of the new UK Attorney General, one would have to say that consider that the advice offered to the government on the Gaza issues before the International Criminal Court would probably be for the UK not to stand in the way, as it were. I mean, we have yet to see whether the prosecutor's request to the court for indictments will follow. To be honest, hard to see how they can't in this situation.
Helen, thank you so much for coming in. Robert, we really do appreciate it. We need to move on to some housing issues because Bernard's podcast is really about housing with a small amount of international affairs tacked on. Thank you
Everything
so much,
is always about
housing.
housing.
As always, Robert. I'm glad to see you back. Thanks,
Thank you
Helen.
very much. Nice to see you all.
Hey, Patrick.
Kia ora.
You're John's brother, right?
Indeed, yes.
Yeah.
Ah, very good.
Only 3 of them are John's, but carry on.
That's right. Lovely to see you, Patrick. For those who may not recognise the face, Patrick Reynolds is a hero of New Zealand's blogging community, I think. The transport blog of days gone by really set the tone for having a much better debate in public about a complicated issue. Patrick has since then gone to be a director of NZTA between 2019 and 2023. Is now a director of Greater Auckland, the inheritor of that amazing legacy from Transport Blog. Patrick, lovely to have you on the show.
Delighted to be here.
So, Patrick, it's been a huge week for both transport and housing. The whole, urban development, all of those questions about how we grow, where we grow, is it up, is it out, is it on motorways, is it on railways? And in particular, we got news this week from, in the last couple of weeks, really, that Going for Growth speech from Chris Bishop, where he really put some pretty tough messages to a whole bunch of people, many of whom would normally be National Party supporters. What did you make of that speech and the general push of Chris Bishop to go for growth?
Well, I'm hugely encouraged. I think, I mean, it's extremely refreshing to have a minister say we need to build more houses, and that planning, or should we say permitting, because I'm not sure planners do planning; they actually do permitting, which is kind of the reverse. It's what you can't do rather than what we should do. Is absolutely a block to growth, and we know this. The laws of supply and demand do apply to housing. That is there is no evidence that housing is some sort of weird exception to that law, which is essentially an ecological law. I mean, it's more than an economic law. If you're trying to say that is suspended due to some peculiarity to one product or service, you've got to go a very long way to show how. And that evidence doesn't exist.
And in fact, we do have a natural experiment in Auckland and in Lower Hutt with the easing of the restrictions through the unitary plan changes. Not nearly as easy as I'd like to see. There's a whole bunch of places, Parnell, Ponsonby, Grey Lynn, Mount Eden, Remuera, which are accepted from the unitary plan easings, but certainly there's been great work showing that more building of townhouses and units because of that unitary plan change in 2016 has reduced rents relative to incomes in other places that don't have it and relative to what we saw in Auckland beforehand. And certainly Lower Hutt's another great example where they have eased their restrictions and Lower Hutt has benefited from it with lower rents and lower house prices that would otherwise be the case. But, from a council point of view, they are obviously reluctant to sprawl, so to speak. It's very expensive for their infrastructure. And Chris Bishop is fighting back against a whole bunch of people in the National Party who do not want to see that intensification, all of these townhouses and apartments. They want growth to be out, and ACT seems very keen on that as well. How are we going to square the circle, if you like, of Chris Bishop wanting to go up and out, but the council's not wanting to go out, and a whole bunch of National Party supporters not wanting to go up?
Well, I think there's a couple of things here. If we to talk about the politics, I think in some ways it's very clever for Chris Bishop to just be neutral on up or out, because while I am in particular very keen on up only, particularly for cost, but also for environmental reasons. I think the politics of it mean that you need to. That this is a way to get this through. As long as he does what he says he's going to do, which is make sure that the costs land where they should, because what we've had in the sprawl era is a transfer of public money from the centre to the edges, subsidising sprawl. Because sprawl is a Ponzi scheme. I mean, it is extremely expensive, and it really only works if someone else picks up the bill for, firstly, the obvious thing of the hard infrastructure at the beginning, the waters of any number, the transport. But then there's later on, the cost goes on and on and on. Auckland Transport will have to send these bus routes out for tens and tens of kilometres and run that forever. It is extremely expensive to run the operations, including you've got to have fire stations and schools and everything, acres of tarmac. The operational cost of sprawl is also way high. But so it tends to only function on a subsidy or on a kind of Ponzi, in fact.
Which it makes sense, and certainly the externalities of all that sprawl, the emissions aren't being, and essentially what we have here with sprawl is a government using taxpayers' money at large to increase the value of land at the fringes, which is captured by individuals, and without value capture, ratings uplift, taxes properly in place, that's just a transfer of wealth straight from everyone at large to landowners. However, one of the issues here is that if you are going to go up, you do have to do it in conjunction with better public transport and having,
Absolutely.
otherwise you just have a congestion nightmare as well. So how has the government been going on improving public transport in our largest, fastest growing,
Fastest city, yeah, absolutely.
fastest growing cities? Simon will edit that out. Fastest growing cities, because in the last 6 months or so, we've seen a downgrading of spending and investment into buses and trains, you'd have to say, and the best symbol of that, I think, is this week we saw the government policy statement on land transport for 2024 to 34, which I'm sure you've read a gazillion of these over your years.
Yep.
Has a beautiful picture of a motorway with 3 Ford Rangers on it. I checked, it's the real thing. So, how can you go up with Chris Bishop when Simeon Brown is saying, I want sprawl?
Yeah, so land use and transport are two sides of the one coin, right? And this is true at the fringes as well. In fact, the further people live out, the much more they will drive. That is the most congestion-reducing typology. But you're absolutely right. And the great problem is that GPS, which is the most sort of weirdly ideological GPS that's ever been published, and the most meddling, it seems to me to cut right across the independence of the agency, which is, by the way, an agency in order to have some distance from political whim. Otherwise, we just should have a Ministry of Transport, and then it would be under the direction of the minister. But the current minister seems to be reaching his paws right into running every little detail in there in a way that is without precedent.
Patrick, on a very similar topic, if I may ask it, Kaingaora, I don't know quite how you feel about it, but it has been nobbled, it would appear, having been rather ambitious and quite clever in many respects in trying to really look at its development projects. I mean, I'm thinking of that Glen Innes area, one of which is going to be suspended now, where there's really thoughtful planning to connect people to their communities and vice versa.
Yeah, well,
what's going on with KO?
Well, this is a thing that undermines Chris Bishop's good work on planning, because it's very clear that KO has been delivering 20% of the dwelling supply under the previous government, and that's stopping dead. Completely defunding, and that's critical in terms of housing supply, especially because the market, by definition, cannot deliver below market cost housing. Yeah, that is a logical nonsense, right? So the only way to house the people at the bottom of the heap is with some form of subsidy or some form of public payment. To have the state builder providing these, and furthermore developing entire ecosystems, so the neighbourhoods as well, and this is really super critical. I mean, perhaps the current government wants to merely pay private deliverers to.
It does seem, Patrick, rather ideological. I mean, my perception is that KO has actually been quite sensitive in many places and very creative. But I happen to know, for example, Simeon Brown and Chris Luxon before the election went to a big KO sort of protest thing in Tamaki to object, to join objectors to a big KO. There seems to be a very ideological bent against the idea of a creative and big state builder, if you like.
Yeah, and which I think is going to be disastrous for housing supply, and it's going to make it difficult for Chris Bishop to deliver on his flood the market with dwellings. So it's one hand giveth and the other taketh away. And also it seems that review really ignored their urban development side of their business. And what they're doing in Glen Innes and Avondale and other areas in Porirua is really important work. You can't the private sector is unable to deliver urban renewal in public realm. Yes. Right? That's asking them to build beyond their site many would like to and really know the value of high quality public realm, but to internalize those costs into a private housing development is
No,
is
Patrick,
not
one last question then. What's the role of the media in explaining some of these? Because I think one of the things I've noticed living back in New Zealand for the last 4 years or so is that we talk about a building crisis, and then you drive around Avondale or somewhere, and there's a phenomenal amount of building, and much of which, particularly that Kayangora type stuff, some of the Ockham developments are coming on stream right now. There's actually a hell of a lot of sort of multi-person dwellings being released. Does the media do a good enough job, or I mean, the Herald seems to me, for example, to have a real downer on KO.
Or
The other,
they love the cross-armed NIMBY. I mean, they pearl clutch furiously over things like apartment size, or I wouldn't want to live there, or cliches of, say, post-war new towns in the UK, or even worse, I don't know, East German blocks in the 50s, rather than actually addressing the real issues. And they certainly don't seem to spend much time finding people who are delighted to be living in those places. So
yeah, thank you.
Disappointing.
and just finally, Patrick, the other question about this going for growth strategy, the sort of one big hole I wonder, is a lack of an infrastructure funding strategy. The assumption, actually from both sides of politics, is that the state will not use its balance sheet to any great extent to do it. And you could argue the only part of the state that was really going for it was Kayangora, and it's being shut down largely with the argument that it was borrowing too much. Well, it was the state that was borrowing using its balance sheet.
Well, there is one area, though, that the state is furiously reaching into its pocket and throwing money, and that's into Whakakotahi NZTA. They are 3.1 billion, and then a couple of billion in loans, and this is on top of the previous government, Labour government's NZ Up program, which was something like 6.9, I'm beginning to forget now, billion. So this is completely outside of the National Land Transport Fund and traditional sources. So it's not. It's completely broken any vestige of user pays. It was never fully user pays anyway, not least the externalities, but also there was always the local rating share. So transport, they've broken the model of transport, and they are being extremely, I mean, it's tarmac socialism, really.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to be stealing that one. Thank you, Patrick.
The RONS is a policy that Joseph Stalin would entirely understand. 5-year plans and everything. I mean, it's the full 9 yards. Century plan sent out there, imposed on public. And also a key thing about the RONS doctrine is that it does not need to make any kind of economic case. It's a tautology. Every 4-lane grade separated highway is economically valuable by definition.
Yeah, because it gets us to wherever we're going faster.
Yeah. So that is one area where they have absolutely no compunction to use the balance sheet of the state to build infrastructure. Whether it is the most valuable or the most appropriate for the crisis we're in is really unexamined, and is certainly not I don't see the media again doing a solid on that one.
Yeah. Well, we'll have a crack, Patrick, but both of us together in our nagging little ways online, and
Jesus,
it will be
more housing in this podcast.
Oh, you can't have too much, and transport. Anyway, Patrick, it's been lovely to have you on. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Sorry if we cut into your news time. Thank you.
Okay. Good.
So we thought we'd just do a quick skateboarding dog, and Bernard suggested this one, and it's one of those stories that you just absolutely wish turned out to be true, which is that Private Eye detected that the Reform Party, which was the sort of outlier, took 4 seats, got Nigel Farage into Parliament in the UK for the first time in 8 tries, that they worked out that there was an AI photograph of one of the candidates. So they raised the question of whether Reform actually did in fact have candidates, or whether it had AI candidates, imaginary candidates in several seats, which of course would be a criminal offence. And unfortunately, what's his name? the Reform candidate has said, "I'm not a robot. I'm not a robot. I just didn't have a rosette," so he made an AI image of himself and put a rosette on it. So unfortunately, this chap seems to exist.
Yes. He maybe would have looked better with one of those bins on his head. That seems
That's
to
right.
be
Count Binhead is a remarkable character, actually, and it's worth reading it, looking up the reasons why he went into politics. In fact, old Count Binhead.
Yeah. Peter, it's been wonderful to be back on air, so to speak.
It doesn't feel as though you've ever been away, Bernard.
Yes, and we'll march on through to the end of the year and try to avoid any of these.
And thank you
gaps
very much,
again.
audience, for I mean, the number of people who asked me where we were, or even more rudely than that, actually. And then last night, Bernard and I were out in Hoon Bay, and a very nice chap called John, who I got to know at the bookshop, who has a ridiculously gigantic motorcycle, came over and was very pleased to meet Bernard. And Bernard was very pleased when John said, "Oh, I just bloody love the Hoon."
Well, we do too, and we hope you all can come back next week. This has been the Hoon on the Kaka. I'm Bernard Hickey with co-host Peter Bale. Ka kite
And
anō.
thank you very much to our producer, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
And to the audience. Bye. Thank you.